Everyone has a right to a safe and stable home, and that benefits us all. I come with no other agenda than desperately trying to help people who are. Prince William did not hesitate, soften the language, or leave room for negotiation. Standing before a tightly controlled palace gathering, he confirmed that Camilla would permanently withdraw from royal life, surrender her remaining official duties, and make no future ceremonial return. The announcement lasted only minutes, but its meaning was unmistakable. A chapter had not merely closed, it had been sealed by the man preparing to inherit the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William entered the palace briefing room carrying one prepared statement. Senior aides stood motionless as he approached the lectern. Yet Charles was nowhere beside him. The prince rested both hands on the polished edge and looked down for 1 second. He knew the next words would reshape his father's marriage, define his future reign, and test the crown itself. Then the future king made the decision unmistakably clear. Camilla was permanently leaving the working monarchy, the small group of royals who perform official duties for the sovereign. She would surrender every public engagement, ceremonial appearance, advisory privilege, and any expectation of returning officially. William described the departure as permanent and irreversible, language chosen to block any later restoration. The phrase struck like a locked door, destroying any belief that this was merely a pause. Camilla received the confirmation in an adjoining room, where a longtime aide delivered a documented copy moments after it was read aloud. She lowered herself into a chair, held the page without turning it, and asked only whether Charles had approved the exact wording. The aide hesitated. That silence hurt more than the announcement. The Queen Consort had endured years' of judgment beside the king, yet now faced removal without hearing his voice. William continued, confirming that her remaining ceremonial responsibilities would be redistributed immediately. Those responsibilities were the formal appearances and symbolic duties through which a senior royal represented the monarchy. Their immediate transfer proved the palace had prepared this exit long before the briefing. Names had already moved across calendars. Access had already been reviewed. Someone had expected resistance and designed the order to survive it. The prince finished without softening his expression. He folded the statement once, placed it on the lectern, and walked away without taking questions. A palace clock marked the silence that followed, but everyone was thinking about the same absence. Charles had not stood beside his son, defended his wife, or claimed the decision as his own. But before anyone could understand why William had spoken with such finality, they had to confront the private loyalties being torn apart behind the palace doors. Behind the announcement stood 3 people bound together by the crown, marriage, memory, and wounds that had never fully healed. William carried the expectations of the future. Charles carried the weight of a husband forced to measure private devotion against public duty. Camilla faced the terrifying possibility that the institution she had spent decades entering was now asking her to disappear without resistance. For each of them, the decision meant something painfully different. William understood that his silence could no longer protect anyone. As Prince of Wales, the title held by the monarch's direct heir, he carried responsibility for the shape, stability, and public trust of the next reign. Every unresolved argument surrounding Camilla could follow him onto the throne. Every special exception granted to her could create a second centre of influence around his father, leaving the future king responsible for a monarchy divided before his reign had even begun. Charles felt the pressure from the opposite direction. He remained sovereign, the reigning head of the monarchy, but every choice involving his wife now reached beyond his own lifetime. The king loved her as the woman who had stood beside him through rejection, scandal, and years of public hostility. Yet he also knew William would inherit every weakness left unresolved. Protecting Camilla might preserve his marriage today, but it could burden his son's crown tomorrow. Camilla experienced that calculation as betrayal. She believed she had survived the hardest years beside Charles, defended him when public anger was relentless, and waited decades for acceptance. Now, when the institution finally appeared secure around them, she was being asked to leave because the future mattered more than the sacrifices of their past. The Queen Consort did not fear losing ceremonies as much as she feared what the decision said about her place in the king's heart. William remembered earlier crises when royal survival had depended on restraint. Silence had once been presented as strength, but this time, silence would make the prince appear afraid to lead. A documented private schedule showed that he met Charles twice during the 48 hours before the announcement. The first meeting ended after 22 minutes, the second lasted barely 12. Both had been reserved for an hour. Catherine knew the statement was coming, yet she stayed away from the briefing. The Princess of Wales, the wife of the heir and future queen, remained with their children, while her husband prepared to alter the family hierarchy. She understood his duty, but she also understood the emotional cost. Catherine called him before he entered the room and reminded him that firmness did not require cruelty. Charles sat alone afterward with William's final draft open before him. He read the last page twice, removed his glasses and placed them beside the document, without adding his signature. The king's silence revealed that the conflict was deeper than public duties. Somewhere behind the announcement stood one exact moment, when private tension became impossible to contain. And that incident began not with a public scandal, but with a sealed meeting, whose final sentence changed the course of the monarchy. For months, the palace had managed disagreements through private conversations, delayed decisions, and carefully arranged compromises. Then came the Windsor succession briefing, the meeting that everyone later remembered as the moment restraint collapsed. No cameras were present, no public statement followed. Yet inside that room, Camilla challenged a future arrangement William considered essential. Charles refused to intervene, and a single demand transformed tension into a permanent break. 6 weeks before the announcement, Charles entered the meeting beside Camilla and immediately sensed the strain. William sat opposite them with Catherine and Princess Anne, while 2 constitutional advisors waited in silence. The Windsor succession briefing was a private planning session designed to decide how duties, residences, and access would operate when the future king eventually inherited the throne. It mattered because any unresolved role could create confusion at the exact moment the monarchy needed unity. Camilla spoke before the advisors reached the final page. She demanded a permanent formal place inside William's future court, including access to weekly sovereign briefings and authority over selected household appointments. A future court meant the private and official team serving the next monarch after accession. Her request was not symbolic. It would allow the Queen Consort to remain close to decisions even after Charles no longer held power. William refused without raising his voice. The prince said his reign could not begin with a parallel influence inherited from his father's marriage. He argued that the crown needed one clear centre of authority, not competing loyalties shaped by the previous reign. Catherine watched him choose each word carefully, while Anne remained still, already understanding that compromise was slipping away. Camilla turned toward Charles and waited. The king did not defend her, reject the request, or ask for more time. He simply looked down at the table. His silence left her shaken, but it affected William differently. The future king saw proof that his father would never set the boundary himself, and that the problem could no longer be delayed. Camilla warned that excluding her would become a public humiliation and damage everything Charles had spent years rebuilding around their marriage. Anne answered with controlled force. The Princess Royal said the crown could not be governed by fear of appearances, because protecting one person's dignity could not outweigh the stability of the next reign. William rose before the meeting formally ended. In a documented private exchange near the closed door, he told Charles that unless the arrangement was settled immediately, he would make the separation public himself. The king stared back but offered no promise. Camilla pushed her chair away, removed a palace access card from her handbag, and placed it on the table. After William left, Charles quietly picked it up and returned it to her. The gesture looked compassionate, but it carried a darker meaning. The monarch had postponed the boundary again. The next time the 3 of them entered the same room, there would be no advisors, no written agenda, and no compromise left to protect them. The confrontation lasted less than half an hour, but every buried grievance entered the room with them. William did not speak as a wounded son, and Camilla refused to respond as a ceremonial figure prepared to accept dismissal. Charles stood between them, physically present but emotionally divided. What began as a discussion about future duties became a reckoning over loyalty, sacrifice, Diana's shadow, and who had the right to shape the monarchy after Charles. William requested the meeting at Clarence House and insisted that no aides, private secretaries, or legal advisors be present. Clarence House was the king's London residence and the place where many of his most personal royal decisions were handled away from formal palace rooms. The prince arrived carrying the permanent exit document, a written order setting out Camilla's final withdrawal from public duties and future influence. He placed it unopened on the low table between them and waited. Camilla broke the silence first. She accused William of disguising an old resentment as institutional reform, saying he was using the future crown to settle wounds that had never healed. The Queen Consort did not mention Diana directly, but her meaning was unmistakable. She believed the past had entered the room before she had, and that the prince had already judged her before the conversation began. William felt anger rise, but he refused to let it take control. He told her the decision was not revenge, it was protection. The future king said the monarchy could not begin its next chapter trapped inside unresolved family history, divided loyalties, and private promises that no future sovereign had agreed to honour. His voice remained calm, but the restraint made every word feel heavier. Charles finally spoke. In a recorded private account, later preserved by one of his senior household officials, the king admitted that he had promised Camilla she would never be pushed aside while he lived. He called it a personal vow made after years of public hostility. William answered that a husband could make such a promise, but a monarch could not bind the reign of his successor. Camilla then asked the question she had been holding back. Would Catherine inherit everything being taken from me? William confirmed that some duties would pass to the Princess of Wales, the title held by the future king's wife, while other responsibilities would disappear completely. The answer cut deeper than removal. It meant the palace was not merely replacing her, it was redesigning itself without her. Camilla rose and walked toward the door. Then she stopped, turned, and asked Charles to stop his son. The king looked down at the unopened document and said nothing. William left, believing the decision was settled. Yet the unsigned pages remained between them like a warning. Because behind the family confrontation stood a more decisive question. Who actually possessed the power to make Camilla's disappearance permanent? Royal power rarely arrives with raised voices. It moves through signatures, schedules, sealed instructions, and doors that no longer open. While the family struggled with grief and resentment, the palace machinery had already begun preparing for Camilla's departure. Yet the process was not automatic. William needed Charles's authority, Anne's support, and the household's obedience. One hesitation could turn a controlled exit into a constitutional and emotional crisis. William moved quickly after the confrontation. The prince approved the creation of a transition group, a small palace team responsible for transferring duties, staff access, residences, and future engagements from one royal figure to another. Its members began removing Camilla from patronage decisions, internal briefings, ceremonial planning, and long-term household schedules. The changes mattered because leaving even one official channel open could allow uncertainty to survive into the next reign. Charles understood the limits of his son's power. While the king remained sovereign, William could not simply erase his wife's position or command the royal household without approval. Yet the future king could declare that no special role would continue that after his accession, the formal moment when an heir becomes monarch. That threat placed the present reign under pressure from the future, forcing the father to decide what his son would otherwise settle later. Charles studied the transfer papers alone. Each reassigned duty felt like another public admission that Camilla's royal life was ending. Her name had already disappeared from 3 future state occasions before the announcement: a diplomatic reception, a national service, and an overseas delegation. State occasions were official events held on behalf of the crown, and removal from them meant the palace was no longer planning around her presence. Anne entered after her brother had read the papers twice. The Princess Royal closed the door and told him that delay would now be crueler than finality. She knew the decision was breaking Charles, but she also knew that hesitation would keep Camilla trapped between authority and rejection. The king asked whether William might accept a private advisory role for her. His sister answered that hidden influence would create the same conflict under a softer name. A confidential instruction made the boundary absolute. Camilla's private access to sovereign briefings, the sensitive weekly discussions prepared for the monarch, would end immediately, preventing her from shaping decisions after surrendering public duties. William had insisted on that clause because ceremonial withdrawal meant nothing if influence continued behind closed doors. Charles lifted the pen and held it above the authorization page. For several seconds, he did not move. Then the monarch signed only his first name and slid the document toward Anne without speaking. She accepted it gently, knowing the signature had protected William's future while wounding her brother's present. The authority was finally secured, but once those instructions reached the household, Camilla would no longer experience the decision as careful language or distant planning. She would feel it through missing papers, cancelled meetings, and the silence of people who once waited for her command. And by the following morning, the first doors had begun to close in ways no statement could disguise. The true force of the announcement became clear the next morning. There were no dramatic guards, no public removal, and no final procession. Instead, Camilla discovered that her calendar had been emptied. Her briefing folder had not arrived, and staff who once waited for her instructions now answered to someone else. Royal exile did not begin with a command. It began with absence, and with the unbearable realization that the palace had already learned to continue without her. Camilla entered her morning sitting room, expecting the familiar weight of routine to steady her. The table held personal letters, a cup of tea, and an empty space where the red briefing box should have been. That box was the locked case used to deliver confidential government and palace papers to senior royals. Its absence mattered because it confirmed that she had not merely lost public appearances. She had been cut away from the information that once made her part of the Crown's daily life. Camilla asked her longtime aide whether the delivery had been delayed. The woman paused before explaining that access had ended at midnight under William's signed transition order. She spoke softly, but the answer landed with brutal force. The Queen Consort looked toward the empty place again, as though the box might appear if she waited long enough. It did not. The palace had already cancelled, postponed, or reassigned every official engagement attached to her name. Her charitable offices received written instructions stating that future communication would pass through a reduced private secretariat, a small personal staff operating outside the central royal household. That change mattered because charities once able to contact the palace directly would now reach only a private office with no influence over royal planning. Several staff members learnt their fate before Camilla learned hers. Transfer notices moved them into Catherine's office, William's household, or other royal departments. The Queen Consort discovered the changes through a documented staffing list left beside her correspondence. Some names were marked for immediate reassignment, others carried no decision at all. She read each line slowly, realising that people who had served beside her for years were already being absorbed into a future that excluded her. Charles made one final request through a recorded telephone conversation with William. The king asked that his wife retain one ceremonial privilege, a place beside him at a private annual service. The prince refused. He warned that even one exception could weaken the phrase permanent and irreversible, allowing every future appearance to become a new argument over restoration. The monarch ended the call without agreement, knowing his son had protected the decision by denying him even a personal gesture. Camilla opened her diary and turned through several blank weeks. She closed it when footsteps approached, expecting Charles or an official explanation. Instead, Anne entered alone. The Princess Royal carried no folder and brought no aides. She had not come to negotiate policy. She had come to say what neither the king nor the future king had been able to tell her directly. For the first time since the crisis began, two women sat alone without the crown between them. And what passed across that room changed the meaning of the exit. Anne arrived alone. She carried no folder, no list of conditions, and no message written by palace lawyers. Camilla expected another explanation of what she had lost. Instead, the Princess Royal offered something far more difficult, the truth. She told her that William's decision was final. Charles was too wounded to say it clearly, and dignity could now be preserved only if Camilla stopped fighting the institution that had already moved beyond her. Anna closed the door and sat across from her without an aide nearby. The Princess Royal was the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter. But in that room, it meant less than the private burden both women understood,